In this final lesson looking at the political ideology of liberalism, we're going to talk about the kind of ideology which sort of bridges the gap between the liberal and the conservative, because we're going to talk about neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is often associated with very conservative politicians and ideologies, and we'll explain why this is the case in this lesson. But we're going to sort of talk about it as a sort of an anomaly within the broader liberal tradition. So it was the philosopher F.A. Hayek who wrote in his book *The Road to Serfdom* that neoliberalism is the most prominent of ideologies. Essentially, he was the most prominent neoliberal thinker, or at least was the person who coined, or at least contributed very significantly to the movement. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about neoliberalism is that it is not necessarily an easy, nor is it even a coherent philosophical position for one to understand. This is not necessarily to suggest that it is therefore wrong, or it is therefore bad in one way or another, but that it is just less coherent in terms of the general praxis in which it is trying to advocate for different political change. It is often confused with a number of other political and philosophical positions, which of course also contributes to its lack of coherency and its difficulty to understand. One of the things that Hayek argues in The Road to Serfdom is that modern liberals, the idea of modern liberalism, the likes of people like Rawls, people who argue for things such as social democracy, democratic socialism to an extent, argue that, essentially Hayek argues that these individuals have almost strayed away from the original ideals of liberalism. And so to an extent, and in a lot of different ways, neoliberalism is something that contributes to and is associated quite closely with classical liberalism, with the classical ideas of liberalism, especially when we talk about economic positions. And Hayek agrees. Hayek argues that we should return to this idea of liberalism from the classical period and classical liberal ideas. And so as a result of which, because neoliberalism is associated quite heavily with free market economies, the destruction of protectionism within international trade, for example, and other issues of that kind of nature, it is often associated quite closely with more conservative ideologies to this day, rather than liberalism, given the fact that modern liberalism has moved further left, and neoliberalism would sort of sit itself more as a kind of centre to centre-right position. So it is often seen, for example, that neoliberalism is a conservative ideology, and this is obviously because it is closely linked with prominent conservative politicians, people like Thatcher and Reagan in the 1980s. And it is also closely associated with the kind of conservative ideologies that were going around within the sort of Washington consensus, and also became incredibly prevalent following the end of the Cold War in 1989-1991. The reason why this is the case is because there was the growing belief that neoliberal capitalism is the only solution to any kind of economic or social problem in the world, because the only alternative to neoliberal capitalism at the time was the communist states of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union collapsed. The US and the capitalists won the Cold War, and so the idea was, well, we are clearly correct in our assumption that neoliberalism is the only solution to all of these problems. And so we see quite a strong embedding of neoliberalism into a lot of societal structures, both national and international, as a result of the end of the Cold War. And this is, of course, closely linked with people like Thatcher and Reagan, who were in office very close towards the end of the Cold War itself in the 1980s. Neoliberalism is can be seen as conservative owing to a partial idea of it being potentially reactionary, so reacting against modern liberalism. That's one of the things that Hayek does in A Road to Serfdom, because he argues that we should go back to classical ideas of liberalism and we should reject modern liberalism. So to an extent, neoliberalism is a reaction against modern liberalism. But in addition to this, we also see that neoliberalism is closely associated with conservatism because of its economic positions, okay? Because of the economic positions such as free trade, free markets, minimal government control, and supply-side theory. So there are a number of different policy associations that are linked with neoliberalism, which includes the reapplication of the ideas of the free market capitalism, a rejection of this idea of government intervention within the markets for any purpose of any kind in relation to this issue. The idea of private property and negative freedom being central to classical ideas of liberalism. So reapplying the idea of of negative freedom, should I say, and private property as central to ideas of liberal thought. If you look at movements like social democracy, for example, which is sort of seen to be born out of the modern liberal movements, you would argue that some of the core tenets of social democracy probably isn't private property and negative freedom. In reality, the core tenets of social democracy relates to things like the recognition of systemic oppression, the recognition of systemic injustice, and also the recognition of distributive justice for those who are less well off in society. In addition to this, there is also the heavily negative view of the welfare state within the neoliberal traditions, and you can just see this with the policy prescriptions, especially of the likes of Margaret Thatcher, who cut very significantly a lot of the welfare state during her time in office as Conservative Prime Minister. We also see on an international scale, the advocation of free trade, free markets, globalization, a lack of something known as protectionism, a reduction in tariff barriers, and so a lot of people and a lot of advocates against neoliberalism, in fact, would argue that one of the core embedded neoliberal thinkings or institutions, should I say, can be represented in institutions like the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and the way in which international investment is regulated is seen to be heavily influenced and dominated by globalization and neoliberalism. You also have the heavy emphasis on supply-side theory and trickle-down economics, the view that if we are going to reduce taxation on the very wealthy in society, that means that those very wealthy people in society have more money, and that more money will then be spent in the economy, and that will eventually trickle down to the rest of us in society. And so as a result of which you see people like Thatcher and Reagan go about quite significant tax cuts of the very rich in society, and a cut on welfare spending as well. So all of these things you can see are quite associated with what would be considered to be more conservative economic ideas compared to more liberal ideas, which is why neoliberalism sort of bridges the gap between these two ideals.